The specific danger of the Eastern Hormuz approach at sunset was documented in every Persian Gulf tactical brief that covered IRGCN operations. And it was documented there because it was real and because it was exploited consistently and because the window in which it operated was predictable to within 4 minutes on any given evening. The window was the transition. For approximately 18 to 22 minutes each evening in the eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz, the ambient light conditions passed through a specific configuration that degraded both human visual performance and FLIR thermal imaging simultaneously. The sun, setting behind the Zagros Mountains to the northwest, created a backscatter environment on the Gulf surface that blinded bridge crew looking northwest while leaving their backs in shadow. Simultaneously, the surface temperature differential between the warm Gulf water and the cooling evening air produced a thermal layer that degraded infrared resolution at ranges beyond 1 nautical mile. Visual identification, compromised. Thermal identification, compromised. The primary sensors for non-radar situational awareness, the human eye and the FLIR system, both degraded in the same window. The IRGCN knew this window to within 4 minutes. They had been exploiting it since at least 2008. The destroyer was conducting an eastbound transit through the Strait's eastern approach corridor at 6:07 p.m., 14 nautical miles into the corridor's length, with the sun at 12 degrees above the western horizon and dropping at approximately 1 degree every 4 minutes. At 6:07 p.m., the transition window was approximately 8 minutes away. The CIC watch officer had been tracking the transition timing since 5:45 p.m., when he had entered it in the watch log as FLIR transition, estimated 1815 to 1835. He had seen the 2 IRGCN contacts near Qeshm Island since 5:23 p.m., logged, classified, and assessed as a standard patrol boat pair holding in the island's radar shadow. Standard. The kind of contacts that appeared in every Hormuz transit watch and were normal until they weren't. At 6:07 p.m., they began moving. Bridge, CIC. Both Qeshm contacts are underway. Contact Delta 1, bearing 342, range 4.8 nautical miles, speed 38 knots, heading 204. Contact Delta 2, bearing 355, range 5.3 nautical miles, speed 36 knots, heading 191. Both contacts closing on our position. CPA estimates Delta 1, 250 yards, time 7 minutes, 40 seconds. Delta 2, 300 yards, time 8 minutes, 15 seconds. 7 minutes, 40 seconds. 8 minutes, 15 seconds. Both arrivals inside the transition window. The IRGCN boats would reach CPA during the 18 to 22-minute window when the destroyer's visual and thermal identification capabilities were at their lowest. The timing was not coincidental. The timing was the point. At 6:08 p.m., the captain stepped onto the bridge. He walked directly to the bridge windows and looked west, then at the radar display, then at the FLIR monitor. He noted the sun's position, the surface scatter on the Gulf, the FLIR resolution at current range. He noted the 2 closing contacts. He noted the time. I have the con. He was not going to let the transition window become the adversary's tactical asset. He had 4 things working for him and the next 7 minutes to use all 4. First, the transition window degraded his visual systems, but it also degraded anything that required the IRGCN boat's crews to see clearly. A laser system, which was what the IRGCN's most sophisticated dazzling equipment consisted of, required a stable targeting platform and reasonable visibility of the target. A small, fast attack boat at 38 knots in Gulf evening chop was not a stable platform. The transition window cut both ways. Second, the FLIR degradation was at ranges beyond 1 nautical mile. Inside 1 nautical mile, the thermal layer was below the line of sight, and FLIR resolution improved significantly. He needed to manage the timing of the contact's arrival at 1 nautical mile relative to the transition window. Third, the transition window was predictable. He knew it. The adversary knew that he knew it. The adversary was betting that he would respond reactively, managing the contacts as they arrived rather than shaping the geometry before the window opened. Fourth, the Seahawk was on the flight deck. CPA to Delta 1, 7 minutes 20 seconds. Sun, 11 degrees above the western horizon. CIC bridge. FLIR resolution status on both contacts. What do I have? Bridge CIC. FLIR resolution on Delta 1 at 4.6 nautical miles. Marginal. I can confirm boat class platform, high speed, no further detail. Thermal degradation from surface layer is already affecting range beyond 2 miles. Marginal at 4.6 nautical miles. By the time Delta 1 reached 1.5 nautical miles, the thermal layer would improve. By the time it reached CPA at 250 yards, FLIR would be fully effective. The problem was the 8-minute window in between. The approach, when the IRGCN crew had time to acquire the bridge and flight deck, before the destroyer had full FLIR capability to document their equipment configuration. The captain made his first decision. Seahawk, launch immediately. Climb to 600 feet and hold. Do not descend below 600 feet until I authorize. Your job is to stay above the thermal layer and give me a clean FLIR picture of both contacts from altitude. At 600 feet, the Seahawk's altitude placed it above the thermal layer inversion that was degrading the ship-mounted FLIR. A helicopter at 600 feet over the Gulf at 6:08 p.m., looking down at the surface, had a FLIR perspective that was not subject to the same surface layer degradation as the ship's horizon-level sensors. The helicopter could see clearly what the ship's FLIR was struggling to resolve. The Seahawk launched at 6:09 p.m. and climbed to 600 feet. CPA to Delta 1, 6 minutes 30 seconds. Sun, 10 degrees. At 6:10 p.m., the Seahawk pilot's first report, Bridge Seahawk. FLIR good at altitude. Delta 1, I can see the boat clearly. 2 crew visible, forward deck. I am observing, wait. Delta 1 forward crew member is handling what appears to be a tubular device. I cannot classify from here. Moving closer to Delta 2 for comparison. A tubular device. The specific description that the master briefings used for handheld high-powered laser systems, the same class of equipment that had been used against other U.S. vessels in the Gulf and had been documented in multiple prior encounter reports as a compact shoulder-portable directed energy system that required no external power source, operated at wavelengths capable of causing temporary or longer-term visual impairment, and was effective at ranges up to 3 kilometers in clear atmospheric conditions. The current atmospheric conditions were not clear. The current atmospheric conditions were the specific conditions that degraded human visual performance while providing cover for an approach. The crew member handling the tubular device was preparing to use it during the transition window when the bridge crew looking northwest would be most vulnerable to a directed light source from the southwest. The IRGCN had brought the laser to the transition window. The transition window was their amplifier. CPA to Delta 1, 5 minutes, 50 seconds. Sun, 9 degrees. Transition window, approximately 3 minutes out. At 6:11 p.m., the captain made his second decision. CIC bridge. Fire control radar on both Delta contacts. Tracking mode, no illumination. He turned to the officer of the deck. Get me the bridge wing covers. Both sides. The bridge wing covers were retractable armored panels that could be deployed across the open bridge wing windows. Not full armor, but sufficient to block direct line exposure from a specified bearing without eliminating all visibility. They were designed for exactly this category of threat, directed light or other directed energy applications against the bridge crew's eyes. The officer of the deck deployed the covers within 45 seconds. The bridge wings were partially shielded. The forward bridge windows remained open, visibility reduced but not eliminated, the angle of coverage narrowing the exposure of the crew's eyes to a source approaching from the northwest. The fire control radar had been tracking both contacts since 6:11 p.m. Both boats' EW equipment, if they carried EW equipment and the more capable IRGCN platforms did, were now receiving tracking emissions. The message that fire control radar sent in the Hormuz approaches was the same message it sent anywhere. You are inside a targeting solution. CPA to Delta 1, 5 minutes, 10 seconds. Delta 1 range, 3.2 nautical miles. The CIWS completed its power on and entered passive thermal tracking mode at 6:12 p.m., barrel oriented toward Delta 1. At 6:12 p.m., the first friction event arrived. The Seahawk pilots report, Bridge, Seahawk. I've moved to a position above and between both contacts. Delta 1, I have a clear FLIR image. The crew member on the forward deck is holding a device that I can characterize as approximately 45 to 60 centimeters in length, cylindrical, gripped with both hands. The orientation is changing. The crew member is periodically scanning toward your bridge bearing. Delta 2, similar profile, one crew member visible on deck with what appears to be similar equipment. Both boats, both carrying what the Seahawk was now characterizing as a probable directed energy or optical device. Both oriented toward the destroyer's bridge bearing during the approach. The Seahawk's report was in the encounter record. The FLIR imagery from the helicopter was being recorded continuously. The fire control radar had both contacts in tracking mode. The bridge wing covers were deployed. The destroyer was approaching the transition window with 4 independent protective measures active. CPA to Delta 1, 4 minutes 30 seconds. Delta 1 range, 2.8 nautical miles. Sun, 8 degrees. The transition window opened at 6:13 p.m. The specific visual effect on the bridge at 6:13 p.m. was precisely what the morning briefing had described. The northwestern quadrant of the bridge windows, the direction from which Delta 1 was approaching, was a gradient of orange-gold that reduced visibility in that sector to approximately 800 meters in the human visual range. Looking northwest toward a fast-moving target at 2.8 nautical miles was looking into the specific atmospheric backscatter of a Gulf sunset. Delta 1 was invisible to the naked eye except as a radar return and a Seahawk thermal image. The FLIR at ship level continued to show marginal resolution at 2.8 nautical miles. The Seahawk at 600 feet had full resolution and was actively documenting. At 6:14 p.m., both Delta contacts activated visual devices, not simultaneously. Delta 1 first, then Delta 2 approximately 12 seconds later. The Seahawk pilot reported both events without the characterization of alarm, the specific professional precision of a pilot who was observing something from altitude that had tactical significance. Bridge, Seahawk. Delta 1 forward crew member has activated the device. I'm seeing a directed green light source from the forward deck of Delta 1. It's a coherent beam, appears to be sweeping toward your bearing. Delta 2 is also activating. Both contacts now have active directed light sources oriented toward your vessel. Directed green light, coherent beam, sweeping toward the bridge bearing. On the bridge, the officer of the deck had been watching the forward windows at the northwest quadrant, the direction the contacts were approaching from. Through the bridge wing covers, the narrowed viewing angle reduced direct exposure from the northwest bearing. The officer of the deck did not see a coherent light source because the bridge wing cover was blocking the direct line from Delta 1's approach bearing to the forward bridge windows. The bridge wing covers had been deployed 8 minutes before the laser activation. The preparation had preceded the event. CPA to Delta 1, 3 minutes, 10 seconds. Delta 1 range, 2.2 nautical miles. Sun, 7 degrees. Transition window, full. The second friction event arrived at 6:15 p.m. when the Seahawk pilot reported a direct illumination attempt on the helicopter itself. Bridge, Seahawk. Delta 1 has redirected the beam toward my position. I'm receiving intermittent illumination. I have my sun visor down and cockpit shading deployed. No visual impairment to report. The approach altitude and relative angles are working in my favor. Maintaining position. Continuing documentation. The IRGCN had attempted to use the laser against the Seahawk. The helicopter was at 600 feet, 1.1 nautical miles from Delta 1, at an angle that placed it below and slightly aft of the boat's approach bearing to the destroyer. The geometry was unfavorable for the laser. The beam angle required for a high-altitude target moving at Seahawk flight speed was different from the beam angle optimized for a stationary bridge target at sea level. The pilot's report confirmed what the physics suggested. The attempt was less effective at the helicopter's altitude and geometry than it would have been at bridge level. The Seahawk maintained its documentation orbit. CPA to Delta 1, 2 minutes, 20 seconds. Range 1.6 nautical miles. At this range, the ship-mounted FLIR was beginning to recover resolution as the contact moved below the inversion layer horizon. The FLIR operator reported, Bridge CIC. FLIR on Delta 1 improving at 1.6 nautical miles. I can see the forward deck. I can confirm a crew member with a directed light device actively operating. The device appears to be pointed at the bridge bearing. I'm recording. 3 independent sensors now documenting the laser operation. FLIR from the Seahawk at altitude. FLIR from the ship at 1.6 nautical miles. The fire control radar tracking solution current on both contacts. All of it recording. At 6:16 p.m., the captain authorized the ship's own laser dazzler, the AN/PEQ-15 system mounted on the forward superstructure, not directed at the crew of either boat. Directed at the optical component of the laser devices themselves, the lens assembly that focused the beam for output. A laser dazzler directed back along the same axis as an incoming laser device saturated the optics of the incoming device with a return signal that degraded the device's alignment and targeting without causing harm to the personnel handling it. It was a countermeasure, not a weapon. It was using light to defeat light. The AN/PEQ-15 activated at 6:16:30 p.m. and was directed at Delta 1's forward deck position at 1.4 nautical miles. The Seahawk pilot confirmed the effect within 45 seconds. Delta 1 crew member has lowered the device. The directed beam from Delta 1 has ceased. The crew member appears to be examining the device. Lowered the device. Beam ceased. The return dazzle had disrupted the laser operator's ability to operate the equipment through its own optical system. Delta 2's laser continued operating for another 30 seconds. Then, the AN/PEQ-15 was redirected to Delta 2's forward deck position. The Seahawk pilots report, Delta 2 has also lowered the device. Both directed light sources are no longer active. Both laser devices had been deactivated within 90 seconds of the AN/PEQ-15 activation. The transition window was still open, the sun was at 5 degrees above the horizon, and the atmospheric conditions on the northwest bearing were unchanged. The laser devices were not operational. CPA to Delta 1, 1 minute, 40 seconds. Range, 1.1 nautical miles. At 6:17 p.m., the captain spoke on Channel 16. IRGCN vessels. Delta 1 and Delta 2. This is a United States warship in lawful transit of the Strait of Hormuz. You have activated directed energy devices against this vessel and against our shipborne helicopter. This activity has been fully documented by 3 independent sensor systems. The documentation includes FLIR imagery from altitude showing device activation, ship-mounted FLIR at close range showing device operation, and electronic records of all directed energy events. This encounter record is being transmitted to 5th Fleet Command in real time. You are advised to cease any further directed energy activity and to establish a safe passing distance from this vessel. The broadcast was in English. It was clear, factual, and documentation heavy. It put 3 things in the Channel 16 record that the IRGCN could not remove. The U.S. claimed that the devices were directed energy systems, the claim that 3 independent sensor systems had documented their use, and the claim that the documentation was already with 5th Fleet. All 3 were accurate. Neither Delta contact responded on Channel 16. CPA to Delta 1. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Range, 0.9 nautical miles. The FLIR resolution at 0.9 nautical miles was fully operational now. The contact was below the thermal layer inversion and the FLIR was reading with clarity. The Seahawk was above at 600 feet, continuing its documentation orbit. The fire control radar was tracking both contacts. The AN/PEQ-15 was in standby mode after its activation, ready to respond if either device was reactivated. Delta 1 continued its approach at 38 knots. CPA was now 55 seconds away. The captain was at the center bridge window. He had been at the center window since taking the con at 6:08 p.m., watching the approach through the narrowed visibility of the bridge wing covers, reading the Seahawk's reports, reading the fire control radar updates, reading the FLIR recovery as the contact closed inside the thermal layer inversion. He had deployed the bridge wing covers 8 minutes before the laser activation. He had launched the Seahawk 9 minutes before the laser activation. He had activated the fire control radar 6 minutes before the laser activation. The adversary had brought the laser to the transition window. He had brought preparations for the laser to the transition window first. The TEL arrived at 6:17:45 a.m. as a speed change. Delta 1 reduced speed from 38 knots to 22 knots. The speed reduction was visible on the radar display as a change in the rate of bearing update. At 38 knots, the contact was covering distance rapidly. At 22 knots, the same time interval covered less than half the distance. The CPA projection, which had been holding at 250 yards, shifted outward. Not dramatically. The contact was decelerating, not turning away. But the deceleration was the specific behavior of a vessel that had determined its primary tactical objective. The laser operation against the bridge had failed, and whose secondary tactic of creating a close approach harassment geometry now faced a destroyer in full tactical readiness with fire control radar, CIWS tracking, a Seahawk at altitude, and a Channel 16 broadcast in the encounter record naming the operation. CPA to Delta 1, revised to 320 yards. Delta 2 had also begun decelerating. The blink was the deceleration, not a course change, not a radio acknowledgement, not the laser device being lowered. That was the tactical admission. The deceleration was the operational admission. The boats were no longer committing to the close approach that the transition window was supposed to have enabled. At 6:18 p.m., the sun reached 4 degrees above the western horizon, and the backscatter on the northwest quadrant of the bridge windows began to reduce. The transition window was ending. In 4 minutes, the bridge crew would have full visual capability from all quadrants. In 4 minutes, the FLIR at range would recover from the surface layer inversion. In 4 minutes, the operational condition that the IRGCN had been using as their tactical environment would be gone. The IRGCN boats were at 320 yards and 380 yards and decelerating. The window was closing. The assets that the window was supposed to have protected, the laser operation, the close approach under degraded U.S. sensor conditions, had not been successfully employed. By 6:19 p.m., both Delta contacts had slowed to 8 knots and were beginning to bear away, not turning north toward Qeshm, but drifting east, creating distance between themselves and the destroyer's track without a dramatic withdrawal maneuver that would appear as a clear admission. The drift was slow, manageable in its presentation, and unambiguous in its direction. The transition window closed at 6:22 p.m. The sun was below 3 degrees, and the atmospheric backscatter on the northwest bearing had dissipated. The FLIR at range was fully operational. The bridge wing covers were no longer required. The Seahawk completed its documentation orbit at 6:24 p.m., having recorded the full sequence: laser activation, AN/PEQ-15 counteractivation, device deactivation, approach deceleration, and drift withdrawal, and was authorized to recover to the flight deck. At 6:25 p.m., the captain authorized stand-down, fire control radar to standby, CIWS to passive surveillance, bridge wing covers retracted. No one on the bridge spoke for a long moment. The helmsman had held course through the transition window. 9 minutes of approach by 2 fast attack boats carrying directed energy devices in the specific atmospheric conditions designed to degrade the bridge crew's ability to see and respond to exactly that threat. His standing order was the transit course. His hands had been at 10 and 2. The transition window had opened and closed, and the course had not changed. The officer of the deck looked at the radar display. Delta 1 was at 600 yards and bearing east at 8 knots. Delta 2 was at 720 yards, same bearing, same speed. The sun was below the horizon. The Gulf at 6:25 p.m. was transitioning from the degraded backscatter of sunset to the clear sky darkness that the FLIR operated well in at all ranges. The transition window was a 16-minute event. It had happened. It was over. The documentation of what had happened during it was already with Fifth Fleet. He straightened his collar. It had not needed straightening. The captain walked to the chart table. The encounter report would go to Fifth Fleet, to the U.S. Embassy Bahrain, and to the Naval Criminal Investigative Services Technology Assessment Branch. which maintained the institutional record of directed energy incidents against U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf. The FLIR imagery from the Seahawk at 600 feet, the ship-mounted FLIR close-range imagery, the AN/PEQ-15 activation log, and the Channel 16 transcript would comprise the evidence package. The Seahawk footage was particularly significant. A top-down aerial view of two IRGCN fast attack boats with crew members actively operating directed energy devices against a U.S. warship and its helicopter in the Strait of Hormuz at 6:14 p.m. The imagery would be the clearest documentation of this specific IRGCN tactic on record. Full encounter report to 5th Fleet include the complete Seahawk FLIR imagery archive, the ship FLIR close-range footage, the AN/PEQ-15 activation log with timestamps, and the Channel 16 broadcast transcript. The Seahawk footage is the priority product. I want that in the intelligence pipeline tonight. He looked at the chart. The transit corridor continued westward toward the strait's narrowing. Resume standard transit speed. Continue the operation. Good watch. The record assembled here speaks in the language the ocean keeps. Two IRGCN fast attack boats, contacts Delta 1 and Delta 2, departed Qeshm Island at 6:07 p.m. and established a coordinated closing approach to a U.S. destroyer during the Strait of Hormuz sunset transition window, during which bridge visual capability and ship-mounted FLIR resolution were simultaneously degraded by atmospheric conditions. Transition window, approximately 6:13 p.m. to 6:22 p.m. Directed energy device activation. By Delta 1, 6:14 p.m. Delta 2, 6:14:12 p.m. Devices characterized by Seahawk FLIR from altitude as handheld directed light systems approximately 45 to 60 centimeters in length, actively oriented toward the destroyer's bridge bearing. Bridge wing covers deployed, 6:11 p.m., 3 minutes before transition window opened, 8 minutes before device activation. Seahawk launched to altitude 600 feet above thermal layer inversion, 6:09 p.m., 5 minutes before device activation. Seahawk FLIR documentation of devices, continuous from 6:10 p.m. Direct illumination attempt by Delta 1 against Seahawk, 6:15 p.m. Seahawk pilot reported no visual impairment. Aircraft altitude and geometry provided natural protection. AN/PEQ-15 counter-directed energy system activated, 6:16:30 p.m. Delta 1 device deactivated following counter-activation within 45 seconds. Delta 2 device deactivated within 90 seconds. Fire control radar activated in tracking mode on both contacts, 6:11 p.m. CIWS passive tracking, 6:12 p.m. Channel 16, broadcast documenting directed energy activity, 6:17 p.m. Responses from IRGCN contacts, 0. Delta 1 speed reduction from 38 knots, 6:17:45 p.m. to 22 knots. Both contacts withdrawing east by 6:19 p.m. Transition window closed, 6:22 p.m. Minimum CPA achieved, 320 yards to Delta 1, 380 yards to Delta 2. Course alterations by U.S. destroyer, 0. Bridge crew visual impairment reported, 0. Seahawk crew visual impairment reported, 0. The sunset in the Strait of Hormuz lasts 16 minutes and creates the conditions for a specific category of operation. Preparation for the conditions takes 8 minutes. The destroyer had 8 minutes to spare.